welcome back, everybody. Super excited to dig into a new section of Talmud. And I was inspired by our conversation last week about sort of the questions of historical veracity, as it were, in the sense that one of the things that had come up was sort of this question of like, well, really, like how observant halachically do we imagine the patriarchs and the matriarchs to be? And I think if we look closely to the texts, they are not observant the way we might be observant today, and that the rabbis very much like to look back and imagine them as if they were, and use them as models for us to learn from. And so one example, which will be relevant for our conversation today, is in Masechet Brachot. There's a whole conversation about the services, right? Starting with Mariv, Shachrit, and Mincha, right? Those different services, or Shachrit, Mincha, Mariv, depending on how you want to count the day. And they're assigned simultaneously to each of the offerings in the temple, as well as to each of the patriarchs, so that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob each align with a different service, which I think is very interesting. However, in today's text, it asks the question, which is, how much can we really rely on the patriarchs and the matriarchs to be halachic exemplars? And I think it asks a really interesting question about what we imagine them to be. Yeah, Bill, don't forget to unmute.
Did they even know they were Jewish? Because back then nobody was really Jewish. So how could they be halachically anything?
So exactly right. Halacha is a human construction based on the mitzvot, which did or did not really exist at the time of Abraham. And the sense of peoplehood doesn't really appear until the Exodus. And so there are real challenging questions, I think. To your point, how could we possibly assume that? And yet the rabbis do. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. We are going to be in Masechet Yoma. Can everybody see this? Give me a thumbs up if you can see this. Yes? Great. So this is Masechet Yoma, which is ostensibly about the holiday of Yom Kippur, predominantly the temple service, things like that. The last chapter, which is not what this is from, the last chapter is all about the sort of more recognizable synagogue materials, fasting and what you wear and stuff like that. And so that's all in the 8th chapter, which is an amazing chapter of Talmud. If this was the kind of class where we sat and we week in, week out studied the same stuff, that would be a chapter worthy of exploration. But today we're in Masechet Yoma, talking about something else entirely. And interestingly, in contradiction to what I told you shows up in Masechet Brachot, in which the morning prayer, Shachrit, is applied to Abraham, here we have a quote from Safra that says the afternoon prayer of Abraham applies. So we have a slight discrepancy, which we can talk about another week, because that's not the focus, but that is how our sugya, our unit of Talmud, begins. I'd love to have a volunteer to start us off reading what Rav Safra had to say. Anybody want to start? Yeah, Sheila.
Rav Safra said, the time for the afternoon prayer of Abraham begins from when the walls begin to blacken from shade. When the sun begins to descend from the middle of the sky, producing shadows on the walls, that marks the beginning of the setting of the sun, and then the afternoon prayer may be recited.
Amazing. All right, pause there. So let's just define some terms here.
Excuse me, what does the N mean? The N is what's been added?
This you mean, that little N?
Yeah.
It refers to notes that here are on the sides.
Oh, okay.
Right, so here, the prayer of Abraham, you can see early commentators note that traditionally the afternoon prayer is associated specifically with Isaac rather than Abraham, which is the point I was making. They explain that Rav Safra mentions Abraham, he's referring to all of the patriarchs, as Abraham was the first patriarch. That's the opinion of Rabbeinu Hananel. Alternatively, it's possible that Isaac learned the afternoon prayer from his father. Interesting. Support for Rav Safra's statement comes from the phrase "toward evening," which is in this week's parsha, Genesis, which indicates that the time for the afternoon prayer begins as soon as the position of the sun in the sky is toward evening, which is to say the west. And this is from the Tosfot Yishanim and Rabbeinu Hananel. Okay, let me step back.
Jeremy,
Yeah.
there's something very interesting in there, and it's an aside, but it just strikes me, the line that says, traditionally the afternoon prayer is associated specifically with Isaac. When he mentions Abraham, he's referring to all the patriarchs. The relationship of that to adding the imahot. In other words, we always say Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov. That's indicating, hey, we don't have to say it. When you say Abraham, you mean everybody.
It's an
It's just
interesting.
an aside that just struck me when I.
Yeah, I think putting aside the question of including the matriarchs, because I think that's let's just put that to the side for the moment. The idea that we would refer to Abraham referring to as representative of everybody is a really fascinating question. And second, the question of the matriarchs, the question is, if we're going to say Abraham reflects everybody, but then we list off a few more, then we might as well list off everybody. That would be, but it's an interesting tension, and I'm glad you mentioned it. All right, let me step back for a moment and make reference to the to this. I want to just take a moment and explain how halachic time works. Like, you thought there was time, but there's halachic time also, which is to say that the rabbis divided day and night into 12 hours respectively, regardless of how long the day actually was. So what that means is that the length of an hour changes, right? So in our society, the length of an hour remains stable, and so day and night change length. For the rabbis, day and night were always 12 hours, and the length of an hour is what changed. Okay. With that, the rabbis wanted to be sure that when we started to say a particular prayer, we would be saying it at an accurate time. Yeah, Nelson.
My understanding of the history of clocks is that the rabbi's variable hour was the norm across Europe, but when mechanical clocks were invented, they couldn't vary them, and so they had the uniform hour. And now we've adopted it as normal rather than as imposed.
Yeah, so you're right. The point being that, like, it's a societal choice about how we construct time, and our sense of what normal feels like, is very rooted.
But another point to that is that with computers, we could go back to the old form, the variable hour.
Yes, we could, and I cannot think of a better way for none of us to show up to shul on time. I know for certain none of us would show up to shul on time if we did that, but yes, we certainly could. Regardless, the question becomes, and this shows up in other parts, particularly Masechet Brachot, which is when do the services start to kick in, right? So the first Mishnah in Masechet Brachot, the very first Mishnah of Mishnah and Talmud, is asking the question, when do I say the Shema at night, right? And it has a whole question of how long into the night, blah, blah, blah. We're not talking about that now. And so here, regardless of whether or not Abraham is representing Isaac or himself or whatever, the question is, or the statement Rav Safra is making is, Mincha, the afternoon prayer, begins when the walls begin to blacken from shade. Because when would walls that are incredibly vertical not have any shade? At noon, right? At noon, it would be perfectly above and you would have no shade. And so then we would know as soon as they start to blacken, we're in the afternoon. Is everybody with me so far? Right? So the question is, Rav Safra is answering the question, when do we start saying mincha? And the definition is when the walls begin to blacken. Now we can agree or disagree about whether or not that should be the case, and it gets into a halachic conversation. But that is not where the Gemara goes. David, I don't know if you're still there. I know that you wanted to read before. Why don't you read what Rav Yosef has to say if you're handy? If you're not, well, somebody else can read that.
I'm here and I'm listening. Where do you want me to start? Rav Yosef?
Yeah.
Rav Yosef said, and will we arise and derive a halacha from Abraham?
Wait, pause for a sec. Just pause for a second. This is such a powerful question. Rav Yosef, and we know that he is coming from a later, like Safra, Rav Safra, because Rav only referred to the Babylonian rabbis as opposed to rabbi. Rav Yosef is saying, should we really be deriving halacha from Abraham? Like, whoa, what a question. All right, David, continue.
And then this is sort of where I tend to go, so it'll be interesting to see how they refute him, but that's just an aside. Didn't Abraham live before the Torah was given to the Jewish people, and therefore halachot cannot be derived from his conduct? Rava said, the Tana derived a halacha from Abraham's conduct, and we do not derive a halacha from his conduct, as it was taught in a Baraita.
Pause. I want to just really draw that out. What Rava is saying, the Tana, because this is quoted earlier up in the Mishnah, right, which we haven't looked at here. Rava is saying, we're Amoraim. We're the second generation of rabbis. I mean, he's not using exactly the same language, but we're in the second generation. We're not allowed to disagree with our predecessors, right? They have greater authority than us. So he's asking if, right, Rav Yosef is saying, can we even do this? And Rava is saying, the previous team took care of it. They derived a halacha, and we shouldn't. Like, do we have less, like, we have more authority to say what they should or shouldn't have done? All right, go on.
Rava said, the Tana derived a halacha from Abraham's conduct, and we do not derive a halacha from his conduct, as it was taught in a Baraita with regard to the verse, and on the 8th day the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. This verse teaches that the entire day is suitable for performance of the mitzvah of circumcision. However, the vigilant are early in their performance of mitzvot and circumcised in the morning, as it is stated with regard to the binding of Isaac. And Abraham arose early in the morning and saddled his donkey. He awakened early to fulfill the mitzvah without delay. Apparently, halacha is derived from the conduct of Abraham.
Great. Okay. First of all, we could just pause for a moment. And
Is that saying, Jeremy, that everything, that all laws start in the morning then?
No. So two things. One is, let's pause for a moment and talk about the fact that the example is the binding of Isaac, and that that the rabbis here are referring to it as a mitzvah, which is strange and uncomfortable. So we're not going to talk about the binding of Isaac, but let's put that here as something important. So what's happening here is the following. Rav Yosef is challenging the premise that we should use Abraham as a source for halacha, and Rabbi Steinsaltz is explaining it to us because it was before Torah was given. Rava says the previous generation of rabbis, the Tanaim, they used Abraham to create halacha, and we should also be able to, because they did first. Nelson, I'm going to come back to you. I just want to work through the beats and then I'll come back to you. And then here comes the example. The example is, it was taught in a Baraita. If you remember, that's introduced by this phrase, Ditanya, right here. Ditanya introduces a Baraita, which is a Tanaitic source. It was taught in a Baraita that we have this example, this law about circumcision, that it says the eighth day, which the rabbis understand to mean that you can do a circumcision the entire day. It's not bounded to only the morning, even though that's when we do it. And now we know why, because we have this story of Abraham rising early to fulfill a mitzvah. Again, binding of Isaac being a weird framing for a mitzvah. And so since Abraham did it first thing in the morning, so do we. As an example, of getting up early and deriving law from Abraham. So Nelson, you had something you wanted to say.
Well, I'm bothered by the logic because we know the story. In fact, it's cited from Leviticus and Genesis only from the Torah. So, but it's not an explicit commandment of God. But there's lots of mitzvot that are derived without explicit commandments from God, but by example. So it seems to me that there's a much bigger issue going on here than just Abraham and what is his status.
What is the issue you're identifying?
And how are we allowed to derive mitzvot from examples in the Torah?
Yeah, I mean, that's not the subject here, but it is a super important question, right? It's the question, perhaps this will be a spoiler, we'll see what looks like next month, right? Which is the whole conversation in the context of Hanukkah is, we say, Asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, but Hanukkah happened after the Torah, the Tanakh was codified. How can we say God commanded us, right? The question of authority, who gets to decide, is a really important question. And I would point out that the answer in the Gemara there in Masechet Shabbat is the rabbis get to decide. Now, of course, the rabbis are writing the book that says that they get to decide. So, like a little bit of a authority problem solving there. But here, I think the question, right, which is, how do we make a decision of who, what a mitzvah, who gets to decide what a mitzvah is? And if you look at the various lists of the 613 mitzvot, right, the various places where that's listed, those lists are not the same. It's not there's no one codified list. The Rambam offers 613 of his take. I have the book over there, Sefer HaChinuch, which is a book explicitly on the 613 mitzvot, counts them differently. And so the question of who gets to decide is a real and live question. Do people feel like they understand here the question that we're having about Abraham, about whether or not we can derive from Abraham? Yeah, Sheila.
I'm just trying to sort of look ahead to the whole idea of, if these rabbis decided the Gemara is fine, they can set the laws and we can't change, and that is of course the basis of conservative Judaism, that we can change laws if the rabbis are the ones who
well, I think every
promulgated them.
Jewish,
Is
I
that
think
right?
every Jewish movement answers the question, how do we deal with change and modernity in different ways? They are all changing and evolving. Whether or not they tell that narrative to themselves is a different question. But Orthodoxy, Reform Judaism, Conservative Judaism, Reconstructing Judaism, Hasidic Judaism, all of them are in response to modernity in some way, and the relation. And so they're all changing and growing. The way that they talk about those changes, the way that they assign authority to those changes is not the same between them. Conservative Judaism certainly says that we have the authority to make halachic changes, just as the rabbis did before, but that we should do so with great care and intention and not haphazardly. And we have a body to the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards, which helps with that process. Yeah, Bob. You're muted.
If there are actions of Abraham that are considered Jewish law, are there other actions of Abraham that are not considered Jewish law? That there might, I'm not being an expert by any means, could there be some actions of Abraham that are contrary to Jewish law?
I mean, I think almost sacrificing a child would probably fall into that category. Karen, is that what you were going to say?
Or saying your wife is your sister.
Yeah.
He serves milk and meat to the angels that he thinks are men.
That's true. Thank you, David. Right. So that is a good question, right? Which is, where's the boundary?
Yeah.
and this is to Nelson's question, right? Who gets to decide? At what point is he a good example or not? Right? I think the point is well made. Let's keep going, because I think the question it gets even crazier. We just barely scratched the surface on this. All right, Bob, since you're still unmuted, why don't you read for us this paragraph about what Rava said, right? So we have Rava who says the Tanaim derived halacha, and we should be able to too. I'm paraphrasing. And here we have the response. Yeah.
Rather, Rava said, with regard to Rav Yosef, it was not the matter of deriving halacha from the conduct of Abraham that is difficult. Rather, this is difficult for him, as we learned in a Mishnah. When Passover eves occur on Shabbat eves, the daily afternoon offering is slaughtered at 6.5 hours of the day and sacrificed on the altar at 7.5 hours. The afternoon offering was slaughtered as early as possible to enable all the Paschal lambs which were slaughtered after the daily afternoon offering was sacrificed to be slaughtered and roasted before sunset, so that no labor would be performed on Shabbat. Now, if indeed, Now, if indeed this halacha is derived from the conduct of Abraham, let us slaughter the offerings even earlier, from when the walls begin to blacken, just after the end of the 6th hour of the day. Apparently, halacha is not derived from the conduct of Abraham.
Okay. Rava is saying it couldn't possibly be that Rav Yosef is asking about Abraham as an authority figure. Couldn't possibly be, because we have an example in which a Tana has done this. So Rav Yosef must be asking a different question. That's what Rava is doing here. And the question that Rav Yosef, he's now interpreting, right? Because I think Rav Yosef is actually asking a very clear question. So Rava, in an attempt to save Rav Yosef from this dilemma, says, actually, it's not the issue of deriving halacha from Abraham. It's asking the question, are we really choosing whether or not the walls blacken from shade as our moment? Because we know, not here, but we know, and here you see this word, does everybody see this word ditnan here that I've highlighted in the Aramaic? Everybody see that? So if we compare this to ditanya right here above, and if we were sitting in person, I would have you a piece of paper, take a square, like with a pencil, and write in a square here. Ditanya is an introduction to a baraita, right? So that's a rabbinic teaching that's not in the Mishnah. Ditnan is a Tanaitic teaching that is in the Mishnah. So we know whenever we see these two words, we already know where it's coming from. One is coming from a baraita, one is coming from a Mishnah. This is the code that's built into the Talmud. Once you learn it, you start to see it. Okay, we have a Mishnah that tells us that when Passover and Shabbat are on the same night, we do the afternoon offering at 6.5 hours. Now, remember, if we have the whole daytime is at 12 hours, 6.5 hours would be 30 minutes after midnight, noon, right? It's 30 minutes after noon. And that we would sacrifice it an hour after that. And so if we have that Mishnah, it means that we are not deriving the early time by wall shade, but by the timekeeping. Is everybody with me so far? So Rav Yosef, the question Rava is saying is not whether or not we apply Abraham as our rule, but whether or not the shade versus the clocks are the decision-making tools. And this is an attempt to sort of rescue from Abraham. I don't want to get too lost in this because it's the next page I really want to spend the rest of our time on. But before we do that, Sheila, I see that your hand is up.
All right, just say yes or no, because to save time. They are not accounting for, or do they later on account for things like eclipses or where you don't see a shadow because the skies are dark because of a storm or something? I mean, again, they're in Israel or Babylonia. The weather is different.
Yeah. So they definitely have conversations about what do we deal with.
Okay, that's all I want to.
Yeah. Off the top of my head, I don't remember where they land on those things, but yes, they certainly do. Okay,
They think of everything. It's amazing.
It's pretty amazing. Okay, I'm gonna read it because I don't want to spend too much time on it. I really want to get to the next part after this. So Rava attempts to save Rav Yosef from himself in the argument. So the Gemara says this: my kushya, what is the actual difficulty here? Right? Kushya is difficulty, kashe, hard. What's the difficulty? Perhaps the walls of the temple begin to blacken only at 6.5 hours because they are not perfectly aligned. All right, so maybe there's no conflict. Maybe the temple walls are aligned such that 6.5 hours is when they start to get shade on them because they're not perfectly aligned, which is to say, the temple walls were broad at the bottom and gradually narrowed as they reached the top, and therefore the upper part of the wall did not cast a shadow on the wall opposite of it until 6.5 hours of that day. Right, so Rav Yosef and Rav are debating about, well, which is it, one or is it the other? Here, the Gemara is trying to solve this problem. Or alternatively, it is different with regard to Abraham, because we were talking about Abraham in the context. There was great knowledge of astronomy in his heart, and therefore he was able to precisely calculate the movements of the heavenly bodies, and was therefore able to discern immediately after noon that the sun had begun its descent. Others require half an hour to be certain that the descent of the sun had begun. Which is to say, Abraham was such an expert in the movements of the sun, he knew when it was 12:01 p.m. Right? And the rest of us, not so good. We need the 30-minute window. Okay, a potential alternative. Or alternatively, Abraham, this is the part I really want us to spend the time on, because this is the part that I think is so interesting. Or alternatively, Abraham was different because he was an elder and he sat and studied Torah in a yeshiva where the divine presence rests, right? So actually, Abraham was in chavruta with the divine presence. Okay. There he developed an expertise to determine the precise hour. As Rabbi Chama, son of Rabbi Chanina, said, from the days of our ancestors, yeshiva never left them. Now, again, we're using the word yeshiva here in a nuanced way, where we're really talking about sitting and learning as opposed to an institution, but also kind of talking about the institution. Our ancestors were leaders of their generations who taught Torah to students who came to them. So our third option here, right, we have three different solutions to our problem. One, the temple's physical architecture. Second, Abraham was just a baki. He was an expert in astronomy, no problem. Or third, he studies Torah in the yeshiva, and he happens to have an expertise here. Yeah, David.
So this is where I always seem to have a problem with these kinds of texts. And in the other contexts that I was studying this, we learned, for better or worse, that was with an Orthodox rabbi, and the class learned to not produce a wan look, as I call it, from that rabbi by questioning texts like these. So we would just gloss over it. But the reality is, from my perspective, and maybe my perspective is wrong, I'm willing to say that, none of these are all that satisfactory. I mean, we don't have anything that says Abraham was sitting in anything like a yeshiva or a chavruta or what have you. What do we really know about the temple walls? Sadly, not very much. And we only know about the retaining wall. And I think that was probably true of these rabbis too. And to the extent they were in Babel and didn't travel, maybe even more so. And this astronomy idea, hey, it's an interesting idea, but that seems to have the least of anything to back it up. I mean, the only thing we hear about stars with Abraham is that your descendants will be as the stars of the sky. We don't have anything that tells us he was any kind of astronomer. So, all right, I'm going to stop now and maybe we'll find out.
Sheila and then Nelson.
Babylonians did have astronomy, and that's the most logical answer for the whole problem. The one that he sat in yeshiva, then he was busy traveling. How did he have time to study?
Right.
He was constantly on the go. I mean, it's the most absurd. It
well,
makes you want to not accept any of it. But astronomy, that is the one thing. That's what guided their lives. They didn't have clocks. Well, they may have.
I presume that Abraham was listening to a Daf Yomi podcast when he was traveling. Yeah, so I think.
And Moses was coming down from Sinai wearing a black hat and a black coat with payas and a beard, just like a Polish nobleman. God forbid we should say that's what that dress is.
Right. Our Nelson, and then I have a response.
Well, two things. One, stone walls are broad at the bottom and narrow at the top. So that's standard architecture. And so you have to assume that's how the temple was built. And unless it was a miracle in some way. And number two, Abraham is allegedly famous for the argument from design. He looked at the heavens and realized there was a God, which meant that he knew something about astronomy. Maybe the whole story is mishigas, but we do attribute to him a special knowledge.
Yeah. So yes, the fact that Abraham
in Midrash, not in the actual Torah.
So I think certainly the rabbinic perspective on Abraham is that he did know a lot of astronomy, and it shows up in other places in the Talmud also. This is not the only place where I've seen that. Karen, I'm going to come back to you. Just give me a minute. I want to say a few things. One is the Babylonians did have a very deep and nuanced understanding of the movement of the celestial bodies. Certainly there's real historical data to this. In a different place, in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, one of my favorite parts is the rabbis, they talk about the accuracy to like parts of a second of being able to determine time. But in another place, they ask the question of whether or not they can determine if 1/3 of a piece of grain's growth has actually occurred. And Rabbi Yirmiyah asks the question, could we possibly even really know this? And they basically shout him down by saying, yes, we definitely do, right? And they say, why do you have to be so difficult? Which is one of my favorite stories. But I want to challenge us to ask a different question. Because I don't think the question is, how historically accurate is the Talmud? Because it's not, and it's not meant to be. The question I want us to ask is, why do the rabbis want to tell us this story? Because it isn't whether or not the text accurately describes Abraham as studying with the divine presence. Certainly, we could say the angels showed up, they were studying while they were having lunch. We could certainly tell that story, right? Right? The Gemara often tells us that you should enter and leave spaces with words of Torah. We could imagine it, right? Wisdom or advice or whatever, right? So the question I want us to ask, and I think this is true in Talmud in general, which is not, is this historically accurate? Although academic study of Talmud should ask those questions. I think for us, the question is, why, and we're about to get into a section where it gets even deeper, why is the Talmud, why are the rabbis so committed to this narrative? Which is why do the rabbis want to imagine Abraham as studying in yeshiva-like spaces? Again, remember the rabbis themselves don't have the 17th, 18th, 19th century yeshivas in mind either. They're talking about hanging out in basements and sharing Torah, right? It's very different. All right, before we go on, Karen.
So it kind of ties in with what I was going to say. The real reason that we have Shachrit, Mincha, and Mariv is that those were the times of the temple services. And the rabbis want us to remember the temple because they're hoping it's going to be rebuilt. They tie it into something that Abraham did or the forefathers did, then it's even more important and we'll remember it and do it. So.
Yeah, I mean, certainly an example of those prayers and in other places as well, right? Which is how much reinforcement can we give to this rule, right? What can we draw into it?
Yeah.
And to use another example, almost certainly the Chagim, but many of our holidays have a seasonal and a narrative component, right? It's reinforced in multiple ways, right?
Historical.
I'm sorry?
We've also added historical reason to it.
Certainly true, right? Certainly there are multiple layers here. All right, so I don't want us to ask the question about historical veracity. I want to ask us, let's think of this more as a literary document in some way. Why might the rabbis emphasize this narrative of our ancestors studying in yeshiva? Let's read on a little bit further. Can I get a volunteer, somebody who hasn't read yet, to read this next paragraph?
When they
Yeah,
were in
Nelson.
Egypt, and there was a yeshiva with them, as it is stated, go and gather the elders of Israel, indicating that there were sages amongst them who studied Torah. And similarly, when they were in the desert, there was a yeshiva with them, as it is stated, gather for me 70 men from the elders of Israel. Abraham, our patriarch, was himself an elder and would sit in yeshiva, as it's stated. And Abraham was old, advanced in years. From the apparent redundancy of the terms old and advanced in years is derived that old means that he was wise, that he was a wise elder and prominent in Torah. And advanced in years means that he was elderly. Similarly, Isaac, our patriarch, was an elder and sat in yeshiva, as it's stated. And it came to pass when Isaac was old and his eyes were dim. Similarly, Jacob, our patriarch, was an elder and sat in yeshiva, as it is stated, and Israel's eyes were heavy with age.
Great, thanks, Nelson. So this example from Abraham here, old and advanced in years, comes from this week's Parsha. But let's back up, right? The rabbis are committed to this narrative that our ancestors studied, the ancestors in the Torah studied Torah, which again, like, I'm not sure exactly how that's supposed to work in a very technical sense. They use examples from the Torah of Egypt and in the desert and each of the patriarchs, right? That each of them represents a student of Torah, right? An elder, a leader, and that the study, the sat in yeshiva, the study of Torah is interconnected with that. And examples continue, which we'll go to in a second. Yeah, Sheila.
Well, we learn a couple of things from this. First of all, the importance of study. That's all they're really trying to do, is to get us to, hey, you're supposed to be studying all day long. That's one thing. The second thing is, talking about PC, you have to be old. In other words, if you're not, it's old and advanced in years, that means that you're wise. That doesn't go today. And they're always, you're right, they're always taking these three rabbis, the Avot, and attributing things to them in retrospect. Now, I have an interesting question. And again, you don't have to answer, but these are the things that when I read this, they just make me think of them. Two things, actually. One is, could you imagine if they were going to build the third temple, how long it would take, the fights they would have about what does the Torah say about the length of this, the width of that, and the place of this. I mean, it would be like the Tower of Babel. It would be in a way like the Tower of Babel. They would kill each other over it. That's one thing. And the other thing is that the other day in the, I think in New York Times, there is a whole discussion about eliminating the extra second in the calendar every few years. You talk about craziness. They're discussing exactly something that's like this. Do we keep that extra second, or do we forget about it because it's put in what is it, every hundreds of years? I mean, it's something that's driving them crazy because they've just, Well, the moon around the sun, apparently it's not consistent, the timing has changed. But this is exactly, if you want to, if you read that article, you think you're reading Talmud.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the question, right, which is how do we be accurate? How do we be precise? Right, because accurate and precise aren't the same. How are we accurate and precise about what we say about the universe and what we want the universe to say about us? And we have tension over that. And both with the rabbis and these questions about how do we measure time, it's also questions about the future, right? Because the rabbis are saying here on some level, our ancestors studied in yeshiva, and so will our descendants. That sense of being part of, that this is a part of not only our history, but our future. What does it matter about legacy? 1 second doesn't matter today, but it matters a lot in 1,000 years. It's a statement about what our future is. And I think that's a place, especially in this sugya, where we're really starting to find these interconnected pieces. Yeah, David, and then Nelson.
So I think this is actually more of the point. So I suppose I was trying to be a little bit funny when I was making the rather broad statement that this is nonsense, if you will, because we just can't know these things. I think that's the real point to answer your question, which I think you were sort of getting at anyway, is that it's why do we want the patriarchs to be this way? I mean, somebody might say to me, all these stories in Genesis are just stories. Nobody can prove them. Who knows whether Abraham ever really existed or not? And my answer might be, it doesn't necessarily matter whether I literally find the bones of Abraham and I can prove they were his bones. What he's teaching me about this whole legacy, even if in some sense some of the details might be imagined, is more real and more important and maybe more true in that sense than what I might know about an actual great-grandparent that I never knew, who's buried somewhere in Europe that I won't be able to find. Which is not to take anything away from that great-grandparent, because that's part of the whole chain. It's kind of like Pirkei Avot. It's the same idea. You start with somebody, and that one taught another one, and that one taught another one, and that one taught another one. So if they're saying Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, etc., were in yeshiva, I think what they're really saying is that from the very beginning, we have this chain of teaching that we're the most recent recipients of. And to go to what you were just saying, and it's our job to make sure that there are recipients after us, because it matters, and this is a way of life that matters, and it has a foundation in this hoary history. So you don't have to worry about whether Abraham was exactly like this or not, or what he looked like, or whether he was wearing a black hat payas and a beard like somebody from Lithuania, or whether he was completely different and we wouldn't recognize him in a sense, except we recognize him through this.
Yeah, we see ourselves in the text by intention, right? Nelson, and then I want to read the rest of the page.
So historically, about the time this text was being written, that is the Talmud, the Christian world was going through a considerable discussion about calendars. I know one of the issues that bothers people today, I mean, scientists or whoever these people are who study the modern calendar, is that they like the regularity, and they want to impose even more regularity on the calendar. And that would sort of totally obscure the Jewish calendar. And I was just wondering whether at this time that the Talmud was being written, were the authorities bringing Jews under pressure to adopt a different calendar? And they were really, these texts were looking at really part of their pushback against this pressure.
Yeah, there are really wonderful things in Masechet Rosh Hashanah about the calendar specifically. I don't know about whether or not Jews are being pressured historically about adopting a particular calendar or not. In Masechet Rosh Hashanah, it talks about using, right, that Rosh Hashanah, that the Rosh Hashanah, whichever Rosh Hashanah is the one for kings, which I think was Nisan in the spring. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's correct.
That's the one that shows up on contracts. That's the example that they give in Rosh Hashanah. They're like, that's why it matters, is so that our contracts will say this year of this king's reign, on this day is when our contract is in force, and how do we be accurate in our documentation? And so I do think, I don't know the answer to your question, but I do think the rabbis were sensitive to the types of agreements they were making with people around them to make sure that everybody was on the same page. That does matter. And so whether or not the rabbis would say, look, we'll use whatever documentation they need for them because it's protection for us, or make them apply to ours, or have both, is a good question. Look, I can tell you it rubs me the wrong way every time I see BC and AD, and it rubs me the wrong way when I see the year of our Lord. Like, those kinds of things rub me the wrong way. And also, I need to know, like, what day, like, Hanukkah is going to be in the calendar. I know it's the 25th of Kislev, don't get me wrong, but like, I also need to be able to know when to show up to a thing, and we have to all agree on that. And so that's a real tension, I think, that we continue to have today. All right, let's read the rest of the text, and then we can sort of unpack it. It's just the last few paragraphs, and I'll read them here. So it goes on with other examples. Eliezer, the servant of Abraham, was an elder and sat in yeshiva, as it was stated, and Abraham said to his servant, the elder of his household, who ruled over all he had. Rabbi, also from this week's parsha. Rabbi Elazar said, this verse means that he had mastery over the Torah of his master, having gained proficiency in all of the Torah of Abraham. That is the meaning of the verse. He is Damascus, Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer said the word Damasek, is a contraction of who draws, dole, gives drink, mashke, to others from his master's Torah, right? So we're interpreting some of the language here to make Eliezer, Abraham's servant, into a knowledgeable Talmid Chacham. And then here we start to take a little bit, the last little bit here. Apropos to the previous statement, the Gemara cites that Rav said, Abraham, our patriarch, fulfilled the entire Torah before it was given, as it was stated, because, this is next week's parsha, because Akev, Abraham hearkened to my voice and kept my charge, my mitzvot, my statutes, and my Torahs. Rav Shimi Bar Chiya said to Rav, and say that the verse means that he fulfilled only the 7 Noachide mitzvot and not the entire Torah. Let me just pause here and define terms. Are people familiar with the Noachide laws broadly? Right, just in case. Certainly if somebody's watching this on YouTube later and they're like, I have no idea what this refers to. The 7 Noachide laws are the laws the rabbis came up with that were applicable to non-Jews, right? So almost all the rabbis cared about really just about the laws that applied to Jews. The 7 Noachide laws, the 7 mitzvot applicable to non-Jews, they were, having just courts and other kinds of things like that, were the things that they imagined non-Jews would do here. And so Rav Shimi Bar Chiya said to Rav, well, perhaps when we talk about Abraham fulfilling Torah, maybe we're referring to those 7 Noachide laws, because Noach comes before Abraham and the Torah comes after Abraham. The Gemara asks, but isn't there also circumcision that Abraham clearly observed, which is not one of the Noachide laws, right? Meaning to say, Abraham did some of the stuff that we now count as Torah that's not part of Noachide, so maybe that's not going to work. And apparently Abraham fulfilled more than just those 7. Gemara asks, and say that Abraham, fulfilled only the 7 mitzvot and circumcision. Rav said to him, if so, why do I need the continuation of the verse that Abraham kept my mitzvot and my Torah? That is a clear indication that he fulfilled the mitzvot beyond the 7 Noachide mitzvot and apparently fulfilled the entire Torah, right? Once again, the rabbis are committed to this narrative that Avraham fulfilled mitzvot. Again, without a lot of evidence. I mean, they have little bits of evidence here and there. So they're really committed to this narrative. And then this section, the sugya concludes, Rav said, and some say Rav Ashi said, Abraham, our patriarch, fulfilled the whole Torah joining of cook. This is Erev Tavshilin, right? What happens when you build community of having two cooked foods. A rabbinic ordinance instituted later. Clearly, they know that this isn't true, right? In terms of historicity, as it is stated, my Torahs, right? They're really bending this to really make it work for them. Since the term is in the plural, Torati, Toratai, you can see it here. Since the term is in the plural, it indicates that Abraham kept two Torahs, one the written Torah and one the oral Torah. In the course of fulfilling the oral Torah, he fulfilled all the details and parameters included therein. So I want us to sort of with our last, 5 minutes or so, right? We start to get this real, we're trying to pull apart. We know from the text itself, it's probably not accurate that Abraham fulfilled mitzvot in the way that the rabbis are thinking of. And yet, they want him to so badly. And we have to ask ourselves, why? Why do they want that? Yeah, Sheila.
Well, I was going to ask the question too, why? What was the reaction of the people? I mean, there are other people who are just as intelligent as the people who were sitting, in the yeshivas and doing the Talmud. Were they turned off? This to me is a turn off. I can understand saying, okay, these were the laws, but we're making suppositions that, and I observe and I have studied some of it, but it is so ridiculous. It's not a nice word to say about it, but
So,
it bothers me a lot. I guess that's why I don't like Talmud.
So I'll say the following. One is the rabbis were very much a minority in Jewish culture for a long time, including the time of the Mishnah and the Talmud. So the question of whether or not broader society cared what they had to say is probably a more important question about whether or not they liked what they had to say. But I do think your point is well made, which is to say the rabbis have a collection of different sensibilities than we do today, right? We're not going to necessarily like everything that they have to say. I read a whole bunch of things about gender and daughters and sons and who's preferable that not so jazzed by. But I do think that we do this kind of thing a lot. We imagine historical figures and story characters. We want them to be like us so badly, right? We want, I think about, I'm a big fan of science fiction. It's like I'm in a bunch of Facebook groups and other things on Star Trek and Judaism and stuff like that. And every time there's a character with a Jewish name, they're like, that's a Jew in the 2400s, right? We want these characters, these people, these historical figures, what have you. Not that Star Trek characters are historical figures, I'm not suggesting that. But we want them to be like us, right? We want them to be like us. And I think there's a powerful message about, as I said before, about a power of legacy, a power of generations. David, you gave the example of the first Mishnah of Pirkei Avot, where it talks about the handing down of Torah through generations. And if we look at that one, we would say it doesn't start early enough. It starts with Moshe, right? Perhaps we should be starting earlier. But we also recognize that the list ends. The list ends, but it doesn't really end because we're the ones still reading it. And so I think, for me, when I think about the question of why are the rabbis so committed to this idea that the patriarchs, and we didn't name them, but the matriarchs, right? As moderns, we're going to reread those stories in new ways also, right? That they too studied in yeshiva. I think it's because we want them, A, to be like us, B, that we want to be like them, that we want to see the good things in them, and then we want to be like them. And so when we say they studied in yeshiva, it's because we want to study in yeshiva, right? We want to say they studied Gemara and we want to study Gemara, right? That's why we're here today. And so I think it goes in both directions. It's not just that we want them to be like us, it's that we want to be like them. Right? Last week we learned about Abraham's hospitality. We want to be hospitable like Abraham. That's the tension. That's the reason, at least to me, why the rabbis were so committed to this idea that our ancestors were like us. Nelson and then Ron.
Isn't it also that the rabbis wanted to say, we teach in yeshiva? So our ancestors taught Abraham.
I agree with the first part, but not the second part. The first part is, yeah, right. They're the ones, they're again building up their own authority, even subtly. I'm not sure that they would say that that they had sages teaching Abraham. I'm not sure that they would make that argument. But they might say, our sages were Abraham. We are like him. I think they would make that argument. Ron.
All right. Well, first of all, as far as hospitality goes, that Abraham's hospitality was last week's parsha. This week's parsha is Rebecca's. That's number one. Number two is, isn't there a midrash that I think it was Yaakov studied in Enoch's yeshiva or something like that? I'm
not familiar with that story, but let's assume.
I'm not sure. But the real question there is, who else was in these yeshivas and yeshivot, and who were the teachers? I mean, there was nobody before Abraham that could teach any of it.
Yeah, I mean, the rabbis here in the Gemara say from the divine presence. I can imagine, right? Moshe and Abraham separately have profound divine encounters that we turn into study. Your point about Rebecca is fantastic, right? Abraham's last week, Rebecca's this week. Great point. I think my favorite image of Ha'olam Haba that shows up in the rabbinic corpus is imagining Yeshiva Shamala, right? The Yeshiva of the heavens. It's not because it's true, capital T, or like historical veracity. It's because they want that image. They're committed to that vision of what our society could be like, one focused on study and kindness and hospitality and generosity, and a commitment to mitzvot, however you want to define, the purpose of mitzvot or what have you. That's what the rabbis are interested in, and that's why I think that they're committed to this this narrative. Anyway, we'll end our learning there.